first and foremost, thank you. And now I want to introduce you to our host for the afternoon, Betty Forsymer. She's a member of our Board of Trustees. She was formerly board chair and a longtime friend of Bank Street. Betty.
Thank you, Cheryl. This is the best I can do. It's the old school model for the T. Anyhow, my name is Betty Forsymer. I'm a member of the Lucy Sprague Mitchell Society, like you, and I have included Bank Street in my estate plans because it's one of the institutions about which I care the most. I want it to be here after I am gone. So education has always been important for me, and it started many years ago when a friend introduced me to Bank Street. And as I walked the halls and saw the students, what really resonated was my own recollection of a very wonderful progressive education. But Bank Street is, of course, doing more than educating students. It's providing a model of effective teaching and learning that reaches well beyond the walls. And that's why your support is so critical, especially right now. Teachers and all of us have been through a painful and very difficult year. But if there's a silver lining, it's that we as a country now value our educators more and more, and the work that they do day in and day out. So it's our obligation to train them in the best way possible to carry out that critical work. And there's no better preparation for an educator than Bank Street. So now I'm going to introduce you to my old friend, Sarah Gunn, and my new friend, Michael Nelson. Sarah is a former member of the board and a member like us of the Lucy Sprague Mitchell Society. She graduated from Bank Street in 1973 with a degree in special education. And Michael Nelson graduated in 2019, with childhood special education and general education dual certificate. He's an educator at the Williamsburg North Side School in Brooklyn. And so Michael and Sarah are going to talk to us about what's important to them, and I will turn it over to them.
Thank you, Betty. I'm very, very appreciative for being a part of this lovely event. I chose Bank Street for my education because I knew I wanted to be a teacher. And I had a little bit of a head start because my mother was in one of the first classes at Bank Street and was actually taught by Lucy Sprague Mitchell. So I grew up thinking that Bank Street was the cream of teacher education, and I found that out for myself because it teaches you not only about teaching, but it teaches you about children and how they learn. And so the marriage of children and what their chronological age and the methods one uses to teach are combined at Bank Street in a very meaningful and deep way. Michael, why did you choose Bank Street?
Well, I chose Bank Street for a number of reasons. I would say the very first reason is that before I even knew what Bank Street was, I was experiencing the Bank Street way, as they call it. I started when I started teaching. I was fortunate to work with a number of experienced teachers as an associate, and as it happened, all the teachers I worked with were Bank Street teachers, were Bank Street educated teachers. And I kept hearing Bank Street. This is what I learned. This is the class. This is about the classes they took at Bank Street. And I was like, what is this amazing place named Bank Street? And and these are all teachers that I'm still friends with and whom I respect. And so Bank Street is just creating and putting out quality educators all over New York City in the top institutions. I worked at Dalton and Grace Church School and Collegiate and things of that nature. So these are my experiences. And so when I had the opportunity to, finally say, okay, I want to do this. I want to be a full-time teacher. I was introduced to the Bank Street Scholarship Program. I leapt at it because I knew the type of teacher that I was going to become if I engage in a Bank Street education. And, you know, the scholarship that I was able to receive, you know, frankly, you know, I probably wouldn't have had access to the quality education that I had it not been for the scholarship that I received. And I think, you know, not only was it a scholarship, but, you know, within the parameters of the scholarship, I was allowed, or I was given the opportunity to work at the school as a teacher. So I was not only a graduate student for 2+ years, and I was also a classroom teacher at Bank Street for 2 years, teaching in 3rd grade and 1st grade. So my immersion into progressive education was complete, and it transformed who I am as an educator. And you know, I'm eternally grateful to Bank Street for the opportunity. And I mean, and I'm using what I learned there to this day.
You've been an educator through what Betty has called a painful and difficult year. Can you tell us about that experience of teaching this year and how your Bank Street education helped you work through the COVID pandemic?
Sure. I would say, you know, graduate schools for education have a lot of different, I guess, you know, they focus on different things. You know, some are, you know, very theoretical, and you know, you learn the classics and all, and a lot of theory of education, and some are very hands-on, and some are a little bit of both. And I think Bank Street is a little bit of both, but definitely errs on the side of the hands-on classroom experience and creating, you know, teachers who are in control of the classrooms and are masterful teachers. And I think, you know, when I left Bank Street, you know, I was ready to be in the classroom. You know, I think, you know, having studied childhood general and special education, I was prepared to work with all types of students, from all, you know, all different experiences, ones with, you know, who may present as, I guess, more, you know, I guess maybe you're, you know, students with special needs, and ones who you might consider as, you know, you're more like kind of mainline, you know, student. But one thing I've realized is that, especially in this COVID time, is, you know, is that all students have special needs, right? All students are unique and are you know, need to be understood and have particularities that, when you get in touch with them, allow you to be an effective teacher to that student. And that's what Bank Street, you know, taught me. You know, it's the child-centered approach is ubiquitous throughout my classes, and really understanding, you know, my students socially and emotionally and academically was critical. And I think, as far as, you know, speaking specifically to COVID, I think empathy is the #1 thing that I gained from Bank Street, and really taking the time to see my students as people. You know, I can think of, you know, situations where, as an associate teacher, when, you know, and as a student at Bank Street, when I would remember talking about the fact that, you know, there are times when the emotional learning of the student, that's the curriculum. You know, no matter whether it's reading or writing or math, you know, the student's social emotional, you know, demeanor, runs throughout. And so that is always a part of the curriculum. And so there are times when, you know, in the middle of reading instruction, where it's important, where I need to stop and you know, outline and, you know, make clear that, you know, this student, you know, what you know, speak to a student about, you know, why they're feeling this way. Ask them about why reading is making them feel, you know, upset in a moment, or why two students might be treating each other in an unkind way. And really understanding that we're all going through quite a bit of trauma at this time, you know, students and teachers alike. You know, if I feel like as a teacher, you know, some days are just dragging and some days are more difficult than others, I can imagine what they're feeling, not being able to touch each other, you know, not being able, second graders are all, you know, generally all over each other. They love each other and they're very social. So that social aspect picks up, and to not be able to hug and brush up against one another and things of that nature, that has a major impact, you know. And so that impacts their verbal, their, you know, now students are even more verbal because they're not able to express themselves physically. And so being, you know, understanding that aspect of the classroom, you know, makes me, you know that, yeah, they need more time to talk because this is how they get to express themselves now. They're not able to express themselves physically and in close proximity. So really being reflective, you know, I had a lot of times where I had to sit down, like, you know, I have my trusty, you know, Bank Street notebook here, and I've used this notebook, you know, through the year, sitting down and writing notes and saying, okay, what did I do today? How did this week go? What can I do differently next week? What did this student present to me? You know, and so that reflection piece was also critical because, you know, there are times where the days just fly and you're just going, you know, you're putting out fires and you're going from one, you know, emergency to the next. You're remote learning one day, you're in-person learning the next day, you're on swivel and on Zoom and the internet's down, lots of craziness. And so being able to, you know, have my notebook and sit down at the end of the day or the week and write down, you know, and reflect, which is a major Bank Street thing, was also a major help and the skill that I learned while at Bank Street. Sarah, as someone who has been involved in the field of education for 40 years, what are your reflections on this pandemic and the effect it will have and has had even on education?
That's a challenging question, Michael. But I think Zoom keeps us connected, but it's very superficial. By that, I mean, we can reach out and see each other, but we lose so much because we can't touch each other or really experience situations and interact spontaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a rigid format, actually. You have to take turns. I mean, it's not bad for taking turns, but there isn't the give and take in a spontaneous way that one experiences in real life. And sharing emotion is very limited, I've found on the internet. And I think children suffer deeply, as you have articulately expressed, in not being able to have emotional connections in a
just freeze over.
I think there's
Goes over. Looks like she's frozen.
mm-hmm.
Why don't we give her a second to get her internet back? Yeah. Do you want to talk more, Michael, about your experiences, or we can throw it over to Shale, who I know also has some thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think yeah, you know, my students, and I know, you know, Sarah might be hearing me speak while it's happening, but you know, I found that my second graders are, you know, they're extremely resilient, you know, and it surprises me how they're able to, you know, acclimate to what is a new normal. And being that, you know, many students today are, you know, they're digital natives, and so if, you know, and that phrase we use, that for it's you know, kind of a catchphrase, but they're used to technology. But technology is as you know, iPads are like knives and forks to them, you know, that it's just a basic thing, that it's what you use, it's what you, and so this pandemic has kind of accelerated our use of technology. I think one of the main things, even before I ever used Zoom, the first place I ever saw Zoom was back in 2017 in my first year at Bank Street. Because Bank Street was ahead of the curve. You know, they were using starting to implement remote learning strategies and peer-to-peer teaching strategies using Zoom. And so I had to use it in my one of my like early math teaching courses. And so I was familiar with Zoom long before people started using Zoom in 2020, right? And my students, you know, they're seeing iPads and using screens, like that doesn't intimidate them. So there are ways in which they were already ready for this, right? To be thrust into, you know, doing reading groups with a remote student on the other end with a PDF document on their screen, while they're sitting in a classroom, or you know, doing your reading reflection on Seesaw, recording yourself, you know, all of these things that maybe teachers had been dabbling in and practicing, you know, these became curricular staples, and you know, and students were ready for this. So I think this is just, that's going to be probably the future, you know, of our classrooms. You know, more students from different, you know, students can be in, you know, your classroom can be a New York City school's classroom can be a composition of students from all over the place now, which is my classroom this year. I have some students who, you know, because of everything, you know, some moved to Florida, some moved to Pennsylvania, some moved, you know, so but their innate skills and resiliency really served them. This has served them this year so far. Yeah, I think moving, Shale, I don't know if you wanted to add, but we could move on to the next topic.
Yeah, well, you know, we have a working group in the graduate school that came together recently to think about how to support our alums and current students and the schools that we partner with as they begin to navigate this next phase of, you know, more in-person work, hopefully, and sort of helping children and families and teachers, frankly, recover from the trauma of what this year has been for many of us. And it's, you know, the city is in a difficult position. You know, it is true that we've done better in some ways than other cities in the country, and that we've had a portion of our children able to attend schools in person. But it's roughly right now about 30% of kids who are learning in person. And for those kids, it's often not every day. So the vast majority of children are learning virtually. And there's probably about 60,000 kids that have totally disconnected from the schools altogether since the beginning of the pandemic, that we're just not, the city's not in touch with at all.
Yeah.
And, you know, we hear from faculty who are working in our child life program that does work with children who are in hospitals, that there's been a dramatic rise in sort of pediatric mental health cases in emergency rooms and in hospitals, and totally out of proportion to anything that's been seen before. And, you know, obviously that's not the norm. Not everyone is having that experience, but there are a lot of children, a lot of families in crisis. And part of thinking about this next phase, I think, is one, how do we create more opportunities for kids to be in person? Because it is much safer now to do that as adults are getting vaccinated and we have more resources to make schools safe. So that's one thing we've been working on both in the city and across the country. But then once they come back, what are some of the supports needed to help kind of repair some of the trauma that folks have experienced, and create tools and resources for teachers that can help them feel equipped to deal with this. And so that's sort of an area that we're starting to do some thinking on. You know, we have a center in the graduate school graduate school called the Center for Emotionally Responsive Practice. And that center has done a lot of work over the years in the city and beyond. Leslie Koplow leads that, working to equip teachers and schools to sort of create spaces to process kids' emotions and particularly to process trauma. So after Hurricane Sandy and parts of the city that were really severely impacted by that, for example, that team was very active. And I think they definitely will have a role to play as the city begins to address these issues. And I think there's also academic work that needs to be done. You know, there's been, it's a funny moment in terms of resources, because this year has been a year where resources kind of disappeared very suddenly and there were dramatic cuts. And now with the new administration in Washington and the decisions by the state legislature, like schools across the country and particularly in New York City are going to have more money than they've ever had before at any point in history. And so that's exciting and it's an opportunity, and it's also a challenge to think about how that resource gets used well. And, you know, I'll give one example of that. You know, there's a big push nationally to think about what's called high dosage tutoring. There's a lot of research that suggests, you know, if you do one-on-one work with children, you can catch them up if they've missed something. And, you know, that is a good idea on one level, but if you look deeply at that research, what it shows is the places where it really worked, it was because of the relationship that formed between the tutor and the child. And, you know, that relationship, as we know at Bank Street, whether it's between a tutor and a child or a teacher and a child, is at the heart of learning. And if you don't create the context and the supports to build those relationships, the academics don't follow. And so, you know, high dosage tutoring with an emphasis on a mentoring relationship, yes. High dosage tutoring just to drill academic skills that people think are needed, that's going to probably do more harm than good. And in general, the discourse, as always, has quickly, you know, shifted to one around deficits. Learning loss, you know, is the catchphrase these days. And it's true, like kids have missed a lot of school. So there is something that they've lost. But if we define kids as damaged, as behind, as, you know, having lost something, and that becomes the model in which we try and support them, it inevitably has really negative consequences for their progress and development. And it usually doesn't work very well. So I think that's another thing we're thinking about, is how to sort of reframe the conversation to focus on relationships, to focus on engagement, to focus on repair from traumas that folks have experienced, because we don't want, you know, that to be swept under the table. You know, there's one school principal I talked to in Queens who, you know, 160 children in the school lost a parent, you know,
Wow.
from COVID. And so you can imagine like the intensity of the trauma in that community. And there are, you know, pockets of those places, but there's also sort of a broader experience that has happened related to the sort of ancillary effects, the kind of stresses that adults have been under as they've navigated this period. And, you know, when adults are stressed and depressed and struggling, and that overflows into the experience of children. So there's a lot to be done, and it is actually something that I think Bank Street has a lot to offer in trying to help. So, you know, we want to do that as best we can and are excited to do that. And one of the things we're also really good at is listening and really trying to understand deeply what educators and families and children are experiencing, which takes time, but once you do that, it can be really powerful in terms of thinking about policy and how to use new funding and so on. So, I think this would be a good time to open up the conversation. I'm sure through your own work or connections to others that you've also got thoughts and questions around these issues. So I wanted to see if there's anything anyone wanted to share on the topics we've been talking about, or any questions you wanted to raise. And as you do that, it would be great, since we're a small group, if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself and talking. If you prefer, you can put something in the chat. It'd be nice if you do ask something, if you can introduce yourself and tell us all a little bit about your connection to Bank Street as you're sharing your thoughts as well.
I'm Millicent Cox. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a graduate of Bank Street, and as I left after I graduated, I went to Nairobi, Kenya to teach, and I taught for 4 years in a local school, then an international school, and built a children's library in Kenya, which Bank Street acknowledged in their street scenes. Anyway, I was reading yesterday in the New Yorker magazine about it's about the flatness of the world today, and how it's flatter basically than it was when Columbus discovered, well, I know that's out of date history, America, but I do believe that the world today, because of the screen basically, is flatter than it's ever been. And the article was basically pointing out that children go from point A to point B, basically looking at a screen almost all the time now. They ride a bike sometimes, or their skateboards or whatever, but their head, their principal, or their hair is basically in front of a screen most of the time, which makes it really two-dimensional all the time. And it connected it to the brain development, to Alzheimer's, and I could see that on a much larger scale, because when I was in Kenya, if you asked for directions and you weren't la-ti-da with a map, you'd get a description of how to get someplace, which was three-dimensional. Find the tree, down on the block, you'll see a bench, you'll find the store, up 3 flights of stairs. I mean, the directions would give you 3 dimensions. And then you'd see it. And it kind of worried me, because it's all through the ages. It's not through the children. It's all the way up to 100-year-olds. Anyway, the question is really, have you seen during the pandemic a better need for 3-dimensionality than just flatness? Because COVID is inside and it's not out in the world. We smell it, we get it, but the minute you check into a hospital with a wheelchair or a gurney, you're a robot, is really what I'm saying. So how are we dealing with using 3-dimensionality at a time that is all flat?
Well, I would share, I think that it is true that a lot of the work is happening related to school and work through screens, but it is also interesting because families are together as opposed to separate. There's a lot of ways, I think, that children are being brought into
I get it.
learning
Okay.
about how to cook, where people are living in places that have gardens, learning how to garden, learning how
There's
to be
more family time.
yeah, learning how to be part of a family and the life of a family in a way that's less sort of segregated time-wise. Which for myself, I've definitely probably spent 20 more hours a week with my daughter, who's 4, than I would in a normal year, just because we're physically in the same building. And so, we lunch together, she comes to visit me, I come to visit her, there's just much more time and there's no commuting. So I think that that can also be very stressful too, particularly if you've got a space that is too small for all of those people, and you're on top of each other. I think it can be really hard. One of the things that my daughter's part of a remote class at Bank Street, because my wife has a lung condition that makes her particularly vulnerable to COVID. So we didn't have Zayla, my daughter, in person this year. And one of the things I've noticed the teachers doing that are really interesting, and I think this is, partially Bank Street, partially something that I think is happening in other good schools as well. They've sent some of the materials that they normally would use in the classroom home to us. So like, and a lot of the activities are actually about the materials and working with materials. And they've gotten really good at using physical movement, whether it's dancing or scavenger hunts around the house or different things like that, as a way to kind of keep kids sort of in their bodies, as opposed
Exactly.
to, just in their heads. Michael, I'm sure you've done some stuff like that as well with your kids.
Oh, for sure. I think, so, I mean, yes. I think, one thing we try to do, or I've tried to do, is, get kids out of the classroom. We've done a lot about, my curriculum is, our social studies curriculum is about New York City. And so we try, we're not really able to go on field trips, which has been a challenging thing, but my students, we still have our neighborhood, and we get out and we go into our neighborhood and we walk around, and we use our urban space to kind of learn about, we lose our immediate urban space to learn about urban spaces, which is, which kids understand. And when we read about, the immigrant experience, the turn of the century immigrant experience, and we read about, the fact that students, a family might come from Italy and buy and work their way up, save money and buy a storefront, a grocery store that has like apartments on top. All the kids know what that means because they live in New York City, and they know about, we've walked around and seen storefronts, with that are on the first level and with apartments on top, so the urban environment, our New York City environment is still part of their education. I'd also say that, play is still a big, even though there are, changes and challenges to play is still a big part of the student's life. And, as much as students can build, and, I think of some of the, you're talking about giving instructions when, even though, I might have a student sit at one table and one student sit at another table, they're able to build 3-dimensional structures and give each other verbal directions about how to build things, and so there's like sort of a quantitative and qualitative, reasoning that's going on in terms of how kids are having to use their brains and their words to explain how to build structures. And, similar to like what Shayla is saying, we send home materials all the time, and students engage in art projects at home. When we study the indigenous people of New York City, students were able to create some of the art of the things that they would use. They were able to make models of their homes in three-dimensional ways, create clothing, create the tools that they used. So, and some students were able to, you know, go into their backyards to find branches and to break them and make them and mold them. So we find ways to include, you know, tactile elements and movement elements. And we do lots of movement breaks throughout the day to keep kids, you know, going and keep their left brain and right brain firing. So yeah, we're very cognizant of the things that you're saying, and trying our best to keep kids in, like you said, in their bodies and in the world as well.
Thanks, Michael. What other thoughts come to mind for folks listening in terms of your reflections and questions?
I think you're muted, Sarah.
Internet trouble. Maybe you covered this, and I apologize for having lost the internet, but do you find there's a particular age that's having more trouble than having specific trouble?
Yeah, I mean, it's
With
were you finished?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, like for kids that aren't able to work in person, it's much harder the younger you are. So, you know, under 7 years old, I would say, like working on Zoom is much harder than with older kids, just because you know, think of a 4-year-old who's sort of already, you know, got a short attention span and doesn't sit still for very long, and ask them to sort of engage in a discussion on Zoom, that doesn't usually go very well. So you have to be really creative and thoughtful about how to connect. And I think some schools have figured that out. I'm very proud of what we're doing at Bank Street on this, but I think it takes a lot of resources and time and planning to do that. And so, and from a parent perspective, you know, if you have a young child, it's hard for them to work independently with teachers in a virtual setting. Like the parent really needs to be around to help sort of often. I think the other group that sort of worries me as this has worn on is adolescents, because I think they have such a strong social need at that age to connect with other kids, and you know that is their core curriculum in some ways. And because they're more vulnerable to COVID than younger kids, like the schools have been much slower to reopen with older kids, and fewer of them. Often in New York City, in the public high schools, you know, they haven't done a great job even when they do reopen, and often have ended up with kids Zooming while they're in school and the teachers are at home, and the kids are in school on Zoom, which is kind of crazy, but it's a function of the lack of creativity and planning and resources that schools have had in order to figure out how to reopen well. And I think a lot of the kids that we've had completely disconnect from school have been in that sort of older age range.
Thanks.
Yeah. Sure.
I have a question. Has anyone had to deal, has Bank Street dealt with death? Because the death that you see where people cannot talk to each other face to face, there's always something between the two human beings, or death is so far away yet so close. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. You know, we've been lucky in our sort of immediate community that we haven't had any deaths due to COVID. I think that there are folks who are alums of both the School for Children and the graduate school that have dealt with that, and many of our school partner communities have dealt with it. So I agree with you. It's like a uniquely difficult situation, and it's not something that we've been working on directly. I mean, I haven't had this conversation with the faculty in the Child Life program because I know, you know, their students who are placed in hospitals to work with kids who have really either acute illness or chronic conditions, they do deal with death a lot in normal times, and so I imagine that has come up for them, but I'm not sure how it's been for them. It's a good question.
Yeah.
Could I just respond on some of?
Please.
Hi, I'm Hal Melnick. For whatever reason, this year I've participated in national death cafes, which for adults, it's an opportunity. It's spreading wildly, actually. For adults, it's an opportunity to just sit and talk with other people about death. And I'm just wondering if the Death Cafe organization could focus on teachers who have to involve themselves with families who have died. And it's a very, very lovely opportunity. It's something you tend not to talk about, but it's really just I have found it to be very enlightening and affirming, because death is just part of life. Everyone dies at some point. So I'm just wondering if that's something that Bank Street might want to look into. I have contacts with the people in the Northeast who have developed it, but it's really because of Zoom, we're talking to people all over the country, which is fascinating. But I just wanted to say something else. I feel as if there's a greater discrepancy now between the children in schools in privilege. The issue of privilege is so much more evident today. I still do a conference group with my former advisees, but they happen to be three of them, and two of them happen to be in wealthy, privileged settings. One student is a fifth grade teacher in Half Moon Bay in a private school, and another one in New York City at Grace Church. And the math, I've been a math educator, and that's what I support them still in. The creative ways, as Michael's talking, the creative ways teachers are in fact teaching, in this case mathematics, has been so exciting. Both of those graduates of Bank Street tell me they have never seen such rich discourse around mathematical ideas, because they use pair decks and the kids go off into groups and the kids solve their problems together in ways, and then the teacher steps in to observe what's going on as well. And they're telling me that they've never had such good math teaching, that they feel as if they're doing the best math teaching, and they're seeing more math learning as a result of the group learning that they're doing online through remote learning. But those are privileged settings. I don't know that that's happening in a less resourced setting.
It's not.
I think that has to be looked at carefully. But the excitement, there is excitement that's emerging out of this pandemic in terms of education. Also, should kids be in school for 6-7 hours a day? There's more effort towards I'm reading about problem-based learning, like let kids learn for about 4 hours collectively, and then go solve a real life problem that they really are interested in. I know someone is writing an article just about that, the future of education. I'm hopeful, through all of this craziness, I'm hopeful it's some progressive approach to education will emerge out of this.
just, piggybacking, I know, Sarah, when you cut out, you were speaking about some of the, your ideas on the future of education. Maybe, would you like to share some of those things?
Um, that's very generous of you, Michael. I don't know if I have, I think people, teachers, at least even in higher ed, are realizing that there are other ways to teach than the ways in which they have been teaching. They've sort of been forced, because of this lockdown, to entertain things that they would have shied away from or even rejected out of hand as not as good as. So it's a wonderful boost for opening up the kinds of options that may have been rejected in before the pandemic. As Mel was saying, that people are just thinking of other, you can have a hybrid and you can have a virtual learning and you can have, all these different options that were never available to people. So I don't know how that doesn't necessarily work for elementary school kids, but I look at my own grandchildren and I think some of them who love doing research papers are fine. And then those who are more social beings are suffering.
Mm.
And that's another whole kind of discrimination, the kind of person you are and how you learn, and whether you're a good cooperative learner or whether you're a more solitary learner. There are all kinds of ways to slice it.
Right. I know the one thing that has come up in this time, a lot of families are choosing to do their pods situation, where they it's like a kind of a, I guess, a informal school co-op type of thing where families get together and they might hire a teacher or a tutor to teach their students.
Yeah.
And while that gives some students who need that peer-to-peer teacher, face-to-face feedback, gives them that opportunity, but it also speaks to House point about inequality and the ways in which some students who are well resourced can hire their own teacher to teach just 4 or 5 students for a year. And what there are no really easy answers to these things, right? Because when you're talking about people's health and still learning, still getting education, people are doing the things that they feel are best for them. But to kind of speak to one of the conversations, our conversation about the topic of death, I think this is one of those years where, like, personally, it's been kind of, I've it might sound weird, but like, it's been not that I've enjoyed talking about it, but this has been a year where, because of all of the challenges that students are going through, I've loved having some real conversations with my students, like really taking time to talk about the fact that people have died, and like talking about that some of my students, their family members have died, really leveling with them about like the loss in my own family, and the people I've lost and how that made me feel, and and what that's like, and really, and I think there are ways in which we get to really know each other in deeper, richer ways because of the our shared trauma, and we can really care for one another because of those things. I love that, one of my students said they lost a grandparent, and they were gone for a few days, and students wrote these beautiful letters, and when the child returned, they read the letters to her, and it was such a sweet moment for us to share as a community. I'll also say we've also, because of a lot of the conversation about racial injustice, we've had real conversations about race and identity, and students know about Black Lives Matter. I think on the first day of school, we were talking about New York City, and what I asked students, what are some things that we did a KWL chart. What are some things you want to learn about New York? And some student brought up, policing in New York City, a second grader. And I was flabbergasted, but it also released me to be able to talk about it, because students, it is part of their understanding now. And I think these are, the things that we would shy away from are brought into the forefront, and kids and teachers have the opportunity to have real rich conversations.
Thank you, Michael. So we're drawing to the end of our hour together, and I'm really grateful to each of you for joining us today, and for being part of this conversation. And I want to thank Betty and Sarah and Michael in particular for helping to host and facilitate. And so let me pass it to you, Betty, to sort of wrap up and say farewell.
Certainly the easiest hosting I've ever done. I didn't even have to bake cookies, but it was my pleasure. And thank you so much, Michael and Sarah, for your thoughts and for everyone else who contributed. We're very grateful for the legacy gifts that you are making to Bank Street. Your support now and in the future is absolutely critical. And as we've heard today, the future of education has been really upended, but some very exciting things may happen, and it will take the efforts of all of us to see it straight again. So thank you for coming, and bye-bye.